is given by Jamie Haddock from the University of California. Jamie will tell us about analyzing greedy and randomized projection methods. Please, Jamie, it's your stage.
Hey, thank you so much. And again, thank you to the organizers for putting together this seminar, which is much appreciated. So I'm going to talk about some work that's been ongoing. It started a few years ago, and my collaborators are these lovely people whose pictures you can see in thumbnail. Jesus de Loera, who's my former PhD advisor at UC Davis, Deanna Needell, who is my postdoc mentor at UCLA, and then my good friend and collaborator, Anna Ma, who is currently a postdoc at UC Irvine. Okay, so I'm going to begin with a simple motivating question that's going to give you kind of an idea of the types of applications that the work I'll talk about later has. And so this problem is known as average consensus. It's a toy version of a problem that's seen all over. And what you can think of is that we have some network here of computers where each of the entities on the network has their own secret value. And the goal within the network, the global goal, is for all of the nodes to learn the average value of all of the secret values currently on the network. But the catch is that they are experiencing only local interaction. So there's no global information that can be passed, only local information can be shared. And so there's some simple ideas, simple algorithms that people have long studied to solve this. And one of the most simple is known as the gossip method, which is just like it sounds. We take two of the nodes and we allow them to communicate if they're connected, and they just update to their average. Okay, and so you can see a couple of steps of this gossip method. And so the problem itself can be formulated as a nice projection problem onto a system of the solution space of a system of linear equations. So here I've formulated, C here is the initial vector that consists of all of the secret values on the nodes. And the goal is to find the point closest to that initial point, which solves the system of equations, which is embedded here via the system of equations defined by the incidence matrix of the graph or the network. Okay, and so the gossip method just chooses according to some method an edge, and then allows the nodes defined, the entries defined by that those two nodes to communicate and to update their values to the average of the two. Okay, so there's many applications: clock synchronization, page rank. Okay, but this is only a motivation. This won't be the focus of all of today's work. And I'll give you a more general framework. So we're interested in solving highly overdetermined systems of equations or inequalities. Really, it could be just determined systems of equations or even underdetermined systems of equations, provided that there's some additional structure. Okay, so we have our matrix A, our right-hand side B, and we're seeking some X that solves either the system of equations or inequalities. Okay, and I'll talk today about a family of iterative projection methods. The first member of which is something probably a lot of people here have heard about, which is the randomized Kaczmarz method. If you're familiar, if you're coming from application areas in tomography, this is known as the algebraic reconstruction technique. Another member of the family of methods is Motzkin's method, which I think less people are likely to have heard of this one, but it's a family of methods, or it's a method that fits quite nicely into the Kaczmarz family of methods. And it was primarily applied in the 50s to linear programming. And the whole broad family of methods is denoted the sampling Kaczmarz Motzkin methods. And so this actual method appears within average consensus, and it's known as greedy gossip with eavesdropping. Okay, so what are these methods? So I'll start with the randomized Kaczmarz method, which likely a lot of people have seen. So it's a method which will iteratively project onto members of the system of equations, solution spaces of the individual equations, in order to converge, hopefully, to the solution of all of the equations. Okay, and so we're going to sample randomly one of these equations. Here I'm using the probability distribution defined by Stromer and Verschinnen, where the probabilities are proportional to the squared norms of the rows. And then we're just going to project onto the solution space defined by that sampled row. Okay, so I randomly sample, roll the die, and I project onto the solution space defined by the sampled row. And I do this repeatedly, and you can see there's some obvious convergence that's occurring. Now, Motzkin's method is very similar. You can see the pseudo code is nearly the same. The difference here is just in the sampling technique. So instead of randomly sampling, according to some distribution, we're going to greedily select using the residual entry. Okay, so every iteration we compute the residual and we take the largest entry and project. Okay, and so you can see again, convergence here in this toy example, quite fast. And SKM is a generalization of those two methods. So it encompasses a whole family of methods, and it's got a mixture of both techniques. So we'll have a random sample of, here in this image, there's two equations, and then from amongst that sample, we're going to choose greedily. Okay, so here I've sampled two. I'm going to project onto the further of the two, which is this equation. Okay, so I gain a little bit more here. And then I'm again going to sample two and project onto the further of the two. So I have these two blue options. I could project here, or I could have projected here. And so I choose the one which moves me further. So those are the three methods. And what I'm presenting here is basically what you almost always see when you run these methods on a consistent system of equations, which is that if we look at this, beta equals 1 here is the randomized Kaczmarz method, fully randomized. And beta equals 50,000 in this case is Motzkin's method, so the fully greedy. And then in between are the various sort of levels of greediness of the sampling Kaczmarz Motzkin methods. Okay, so we go from SKM fully randomized to SKM fully greedy. And what you see, unsurprisingly, is that if you spend all of that extra time computing the full residual, right, for Motzkin's method, that you're going to, in iterations, converge faster, which obviously one would hope for that here. Okay, so that's what you nearly always see empirically. And let's just run through some convergence rates. So all of these methods converge at least linearly in expectation. And I'm going to highlight here just what I've called the convergence constant, right? This term here, and specifically, we can just pay attention to the second term in this constant. Okay, so here sigma min is the minimum singular value, minimum non-zero singular value of A, and m is the number of rows. Okay, so we get this ratio for randomized Kaczmarz. That's a classical result of Stromer and Verschinnen. We get the same convergence constant for Motzkin's method. That was proved way back in 1954 by Eggman. And then when we proposed SKM with Jesus and Deanna, we were able to prove, unsurprisingly, the same convergence rate. So really the question that has dug at me for quite a while was, why would these be all the same? So why? And so unfortunately, like most questions that are interesting in our research, the answer is that there's simple examples that one can construct where all of these methods, their convergence basically coincides. Okay, so pathological examples, again, take the cake, and they really just constrain that all of these methods, at least in the worst case, could converge at roughly the same rate. There can only be slight variance. So without additional information, we can't prove improved convergence rates. So what is that additional information that we could latch onto and try to exploit? So a lot of works have tried to use the structure of the residual. So if in each iteration, the residual has some nice structure, such as sparsity, then one could hope that these greedy methods might be able to kind of exploit some speed up for the convergence. Okay, so here are some examples of works that have tried to use actual sparsity, so zeros and non-zeros in the residual. But the challenge is that really you can't expect much sparsity in the residual for most systems. So you always know there's going to probably be 1 0 in the residual, and other than that, you can't guarantee much without some pretty strong additional assumptions. But what you often can hope for is that many of the equations in your system, while not being entirely redundant, are partially redundant. That the information shared between them is they're only very slightly different. And in that case, we can exploit something we're calling the dynamic range of the residual. So here you can kind of try to ignore this summation for a moment and just think of this as roughly the ratio of the 2 norm of the residual squared to the infinity norm of the residual squared. So is looking through this whole residual in a greedy manner going to find you something that's much larger than roughly the average entry in the residual? Okay, so that's what we're going to use. And in some recent work with Anna, we were able to prove an improved convergence rate, which depends both on the sample size, which is something that we would really have hoped to see in our convergence constant, and this dynamic range. So in the case where the dynamic range is nice for us, then we're able to exploit that and pull out this beta in our convergence constant that tells us that it scales with the size of the sample. Okay, so this result is nice. It's proved just here. I've only stated it for 1 iteration because the term gamma depends upon the current iteration, but you can exploit, you can get through this and iterate the result. Okay, so let me just show quickly an empirical example. So here I'm running the SKM methods. So again, beta equals 1 is randomized Kaczmarz, beta equals m is Motzkin's method, and you have the kind of slew of SKM methods in between. This is the error, the squared error versus iteration. And so I'm plotting for you both the empirical convergence solid lines with the bounds provided by the previous result in the dotted line. Okay, and you can see that whereas previously the black dotted line was the bound that held for all of the methods, we're now able to provide a convergence rate that really trends with the actual empirical behavior of the method quite well. Okay, and so this uses, we're computing here the dynamic range in order to plot this convergence rate. Okay, so that's great, other than it really depends, to be able to say anything additionally, depends upon the dynamic range, which to compute is even worse than just solving the entire system of equations in a single iteration anyway. So what can we say about gamma j? So first of all, gamma j lands between 1 and beta, always. Beta equals 1 is kind of better for us, whereas, gamma j equals to 1 is better for us, where gamma j equals to beta is the worst case that we can have for our convergence bound. It's the best case here is achieved by the residual entry that has just a single non-zero. And the worst case for us is when this greedy sampling really doesn't provide anything for us, where the entire residual is all constant or roughly constant. Okay. And so let me just kind of quickly show you the best case, worst case. So what was previously known are these 3 results. So we had in the previous worst case, the same as what's still the worst case, in the case that gamma j is just beta and we lose our beta in the convergence constant. We had some improvement for Motzkin's method. Now what's now known is that in the best case, we could have something that scales all the way down to just the minimum singular value squared of A. for Motzkin's method. Of course, this is a very contrived example, and it scales all the way with beta up to the same worst case result. We can't prove anything better for randomized Kaczmarz because we're sampling a single row at a time. Okay, so those are great, but let's just return back to that motivating example for a moment. So in the case that there's some kind of a priori information known about your system, you can use that to then prove bounds on gamma j or gamma k and exploit that. Just plug that right into your convergence iteration bound, and you have a new bound specialized to your system for whatever sample size of SKM you want to use. So we can do this for randomized matrices. So random matrices like Gaussian matrices, we've done it for Bernoulli, there's a few other examples. But one of my favorite examples is actually the deterministic matrices of average consensus systems. So this doesn't look very clear, but what this roughly tells you is that you can look at the current entries of your current iterate and use just those entries, which is quite a small vector, in order to compute your dynamic range. So you can actually, on these systems, use current information to motivate what sample size you're going to select to speed up convergence. So there's a lot that can be said for just these specific systems using this general result. Okay, so let me just conclude. We presented a convergence rate for SKM, which both generalizes and improves upon some previous results for randomized Kaczmarz and Motzkin. We can now easily, putting easily in quotes, yield results which specialize that result for SKM to specific types of measurement matrices. We specialize our results AC systems. We're continuing to work in this direction. We're hoping to generate some results which dynamically determine the sample size. We'd like to identify some useful bounds on gamma k for other, deterministic and randomized systems. And then ideally, we'd like to be able to, for specific systems like AC systems, determine what the optimal sample size is and how it depends upon the current iterate. Okay, and eventually we'll hopefully choose and use those results to design an adaptive SKM method. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jamie, for your talk. Jemima, do we have questions on Zoom?
No, we do not have any questions on Zoom at the moment.
Okay.
Oh, hang on, I've just got one. You've compared random versus greedy methods based on the number of iterations, but finding the largest residual entry requires computational work, and also random number generation can be a costly operation. How do these methods compare in terms of runtime in practice? And that's from Hannah Rittich.
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. So it's interesting, really. In a lot of the systems that we've seen, Motzkin's method and randomized Kaczmarz tend to actually trend similarly. Often they're sort of roughly on the same empirical trend. And then there's some sample size that tends to be best. And there's very few systems that I've ever seen where that best sample size is either 1 or m. It's generally something in between. So to kind of leverage this type of a result and determine that optimal sample size, we would need to have a really accurate, measure of computational time for flops and specific versions of flops. Like you said, pseudo random number generation isn't cheap. And so that's some future work that we're working on. First, if we're very rough, we can already kind of do this. I have some, I didn't include them unfortunately here, but I have plots where I can show you sort of on these Gaussian systems, because we know if we roughly estimate the flops are and we know a really tight bound on gamma k, then we can do the sort of per iteration guarantee versus flop calculation and try to maximize that.
Okay, thank you. Bin Hong, do we have questions on YouTube?
No.
Okay.